was clearly visible to me that we as world are moving from capitalism to conscious capitalism. It is an era where you cannot put impact and profit in different plates. We as world have now different needs and we look for purpose as much as we look for performance. So the next generation of entrepreneurship will not have a choice. If impact is not a part of your value proposition, it's probably a company that belongs to the past, because business as usual is going to be dead. We look for purpose.
Hello everyone, welcome to the Startup Operator podcast. I'm Roshan Cariappa. Sustainability is perhaps the most important challenge of our times. And when we think of solutions, we probably assume governments or policymaking or regulation are the answers. And those are important, of course. But I do believe the key lies in innovation. Innovation is what will make sustainability mainstream. In this conversation, I spoke to Shikha Shah, who is the founder of AltMat, that is pioneering the production and use of sustainable alternative materials. And these can have a wide range of applications, starting with fashion, which of course has a large impact. In this conversation, we spoke about the nuances of operating in the space, managing supply chains and manufacturing, convincing various stakeholders on a new way of doing things, and how Shikha is realizing her mission of marrying profits with purpose. This was a wonderful conversation. I certainly felt very inspired and optimistic about India and the world. So let's get into this episode of the Startup Operator podcast with Shikha Shah. Hey Shikha, welcome to the Startup Operator podcast, and so glad that we can finally catch up.
Thank you so much for having me. I've been listening to the other Startup Operator podcast and I think you're doing a great job.
Thank you so much. Very kind words. So Shikha, to begin things, could you talk about the founding journey of AltMat and also explain this concept of for good and for profit, which seems to be a driving ethos for you?
Yes, absolutely. So I think when it comes to being an entrepreneur, whatever I recall from my childhood, I think I always wanted to be an entrepreneur. It was also a function of watching my father build his company when I was growing up. And that was a company which is still into circular economy, where they take in a lot of automobile waste and transform it back to metals. So I was seeing him raise his company and me side by side. So probably that got into me. And ever since I can recall, I always wanted to be an entrepreneur. And on another end, I had my mother, who probably stood for values as much as she stood for performance, right? So she was always somebody who would talk to me about consistency, discipline, but also somebody who was strict about performance. So probably from that end, I was seeing life as in when I was growing from these two lenses, one of an entrepreneur and another of how do you balance values and performance. So only now when I got certain time in COVID to think back and understand that why am I the way I am, I could go back to these stories of how I was being raised. And I feel that kind of trickled down in me. And then once I was a teenager, I spent most of my time debating the question that does the world need impact more or profit more? I was very curious as a student. I used to spend a lot of time doing these extra projects, and I was always working on something else other than school when I was at school. So I worked with an NGO, I worked with a filmmaking startup, I worked with an MNC, I worked with Adani as an intern in the chairman team when there was very interesting time when Adani was being questioned about the environmental concerns on sustainability and things on mining that they were doing in Australia. But then when you go inside, it was not what they were intending. Probably it's a beautiful company trying to build the nation, but then there are some repercussions that happen which are also beyond beyond their control. So that was kind of exposing me very closely to the fact that what happens when impact and profit goes in the different plates, whether you intended to or not intended to. So it was just something that was going around me. And as in when I went around the globe, I went on to do my master's in US that allowed me to work for some startups in New York, in Boston. I went to Europe to explore AI and IoT to see how technologies do an impact. So all this was like very prominent part of my teenage, or I would say even when I was 20. And that constantly made me search for this answer. And as in when I grew, it was clearly visible to me that we as world are moving from capitalism to conscious capitalism. It is an era where you cannot put impact and profit in different plates. We as world have now different needs, and we look for purpose as much as we look for performance. So the next generation of entrepreneurship will not have a choice. If impact is not a part of your value proposition, it's probably a company that belongs to the past, because business as usual is going to be dead. We look for purpose as much as we look for profits, as much as we look for performance. So by then, it was very clear to me that I want to do something where I pull an impact and profit together in one plate. Interestingly, when I was doing projects at my undergrad class, one of the project was about textile supply chain, which exposed me to mass customization. So we were trying to build this model where we were thinking, why can a human not go into a retail store and say that I want this t-shirt, but I want it in a different color? Are we as an industry prepared to supply that? Can we have operational efficiency of that level? Well, what interestingly happened was that I was visiting these factories. I was digging down in the true numbers of how the supply chain functions, and it exposed me to the fact that, well, it's very polluted. So it was a very ironical week that I had. I still remember that feeling as a 19-year-old who was talking about climate action in one project, and about love of fashion, or how you use fashion as a language to communicate your values in another project. And these two projects in two different classes actually stood in irony. You couldn't stand for both of it. So it was probably a very innocuous statement, or also an ambitious statement that I made back then, that we need to change something about this supply chain. And as in when we applied, or kind of researched it deeply, it appeared that materials was one thing where 20% of efforts could have 80% of impact. In terms of Pareto's law, it was very clear that this thing, where you're starting a journey from of what the cloth is made of, can actually impact how will it be made, or how will it react at the end of life, was probably the second point in my life beyond understanding of impact and profit, where I said that, hey, we need to build a new material. Life moved on. I moved on to US to do my master's. I was only 20 years old when I was in my master class, in the master's at that moment. So in America, you cannot go to most of the parties if you are not 21. So it was very difficult for me to socialize with the other classmates. And I was having already a tough time to manage that culture shock. And I read that America is going to legalize cannabis. Now, that became a second layer of shock, because I come from a city where alcohol was banned. Well, nothing against any of those life choices, but just imagine a 20-year-old who come from a city where one of these things, alcohol, is banned, and another country that is talking about legalization. But then I was sure that there has to be a sane reason behind it. That made me study agriculture of cannabis, which kind of trickled down into studying agriculture economics in general. And that exposed me to the fact of agriculture waste. Now, this was probably a dot in life, which I did not know will get connected to the other dot previously, but it did. It seemed, or it was very clearly visible, that what agriculture waste is made of, and what the clothes are made of at many points in time, is pretty much the same at the DNA level. Then in that case, if we talk about circular economy, it should not be a function of one circle or one industry. It could probably trickle down, that waste of one industry could be an input of another industry, and higher the value you can convert it into, it makes higher economic sense and higher impact sense. So it was probably that insight over the early years of my life that led me to start building AltMat. It was so encouraging, and probably it was not very clear back then. It was nowhere close to what and how we think today, but there was a strong intuition that I don't want to take up the job that I was being offered, in spite of it being one of the nicest that anyone was getting in the class. I just wanted to come back and see if we could do something about the sustainability in fashion, because it would impact everyone in some way or other way.
Right. Wow. I really love how thoughtful and deliberate you've been. And it's really what makes me optimistic about India, right? It's the fact that we have people like you who are really innovating and trying to solve the really big problems. Also, like the fact that you've taken a very contrary approach to the typical sustainability activism that we see, right? I mean, people protesting things, asking for regulation, and so on. I think innovation is the answer, and that again is wonderful, really wonderful. So, Shikha, that is very useful background for us to get into what AltMat is and what you do, right? So, how does it work? You take all of this agriculture waste and turn it into yarn and fabric. And what are some of your products and applications?
Okay, so AltMat is essentially an alternative materials company. And I often get asked that, what do you mean by alternative materials? Well, if you see oil and gas as an industry, we know that it's one of the highly polluting industry, and that's why we needed alternative fuel. Same goes for materials, and more so of in the cases like fashion, where we don't realize, but we wear things like polyester, which is nothing but plastic, and also a major source of microplastic, to an extent that 33% of the plastic problem is in fact fashion. If you look into materials like cotton, we as world have not been very successful in managing the supply chains when it comes to agriculture, and most of it is now GMO, consuming more than quarter of the world's pesticide. And it makes very little sense to kind of let go of a resource like fertile land for clothing. Doesn't make sense, right? Especially when the pressure to grow food is only growing higher. So all this and much more makes it very clear that you need alternative materials. And now when we work on this, we have multiple technologies. One of our key technologies, as you identified, is converting agriculture waste into a natural fiber. So what happens in this case is that a farmer can grow the crop, some of our selected crops, for whatever they were growing it for. It could be an oil seed crop, so let them grow it for oil seed. It could be a fruit crop, let them grow it for fruit. At the end, when they harvest it, when they harvest the food, they're still left with some biomass, which is like stock of the plant or leaves of the plant in some cases. We collect the fibrous materials from these waste across the globe, bring it to a factory, and it goes to series of processes. It's just a set of a proprietary processes that we have, and it gets converted into a cotton like structure. So it's a natural fiber that it becomes at the end of this process. And once it's a natural fiber, it acts as an industrial input for plethora of applications. So it could be something which acts as an insulation inside your building, or it could be a part of the door of your car. It could also be textiles like carpets or shoes or bags or your clothing. So that fiber then becomes an industrial input into these different value chains, where one of our key focuses have been textiles. So we work with, let's say, fashion and home textile, where we get these fibers converted into yarns, something that looks like threads. And then these threads are either knitted into your t-shirts or woven into your shirts, or different things that it can become. So that's how it works at the surface level when it comes to this technology.
Right. As I understand, there can be so many different use cases, right? I mean, literally, these materials can feed into a plethora of industries. How do you prioritize? I mean, how do you make the decision that you're going to go after fashion first and then, maybe something else later?
Right. So it's kind of a match between feasibility and viability. So you figure out that what's the best use case that your fibers could be applied into. So let's say if we were to make fashion, it is a high value item as compared to, let's say, sole inside your shoe or insulation in the building. But it is probably not as high value as making parachute fabric out of it, right? So it's first, the question is what's the best that you can make out of it, because then that kind of directly correlates to the viability. Higher the value you can make into, higher the usage of that waste, higher the impact of that waste. So it's kind of that philosophy that we apply. We constantly segregate our fibers, study their performance, and keep applying them to the right application wherever the application is of high value.
Right. So, all of this means that you have to manage supply chain and manufacturing. And now these are, very difficult things, right? It's not as if you're talking about bits and bytes, but actual physical stuff, right? So how do you manage all of this stuff?
Yes, you're right. I think so. Even in fact, that was one of the reasons that why we went behind more than one technology, right? Sometimes when you have more technologies, you can leverage the efforts that you're putting into the supply chain. Let me explain this in probably more detail. So imagine that there's production at center. So you're buying agriculture waste and you're converting it into a fiber. So then there are two chains that you have to manage, which is one, the chain of supply of agriculture waste, and other is the chain of value where the fibers get converted into final product. So we kind of very consciously manage both these supply chains. When it comes to agriculture, we actually go ahead and map this waste across the globe. We understand what are the zones which are best to provide for these agriculture waste well in the scale consistently but also inclusively. So that kind of makes us work with different sort of entities, sometimes big agriculture corporations which can allow us to have the access to waste in higher quantities, but also sometimes with self-help groups out here which allows us to be inclusive. So it's kind of having to work with different sort of entities to make sure that you're still holistically supplying those waste to the factory that we need out here. At another end, you have to build your own value chain partners who will convert these fibers into higher value, which is more graspable by a layman or more usable, right? So then we have our own selective manufacturers who help us convert this into yarns and fabrics, and then it gets rolled out to the brands who can use this fabric. So in case of non-wovens, again, we have our own value chain partners who kind of convert this into the final product. But then now coming to the point that I was mentioning, sometimes it's not enough to have one technology to manage supply chains like these, and hence we kind of trickle down to having another technology where we also manage a lot of bast fibers or natural plant-based fibers. So let's say if it were hemp, or if it were jute, or if it were plants which are already being used in the ecosystem, what we did is we kind of merged these two supply chains. With agriculture waste, of course, we trace them strictly, so we know whether it's an agriculture waste or a purpose grown fiber. And then we have another version of our technology which is way more efficient in terms of resource usage, in terms of water usage, carbon usage, and also in terms of performance, which helps us give out another fiber, let's say hemp fiber in this case, and it can be plugged back to our value chain partners. So our value chain partners also have incremental gains out of what they're working with AltMat. So that's how we manage both efficiencies at the production level, but also efficiencies for both our partners, whether it's the supplier of the waste or the buyer of the fiber to convert it into the final product.
Right. At one end, you work with farmers and people involved in agriculture, right? And here, I mean, there is this whole, I won't say dichotomy, but then you will have to pay them fair price, but also work really closely to standardize the yield and things to that effect. But if you're talking about waste, I mean, I would say it would be less of a concern. But how do you balance these two things?
So I think here's where the onus also is in the technology maker or on the production. Sometimes what happens is that the technology is fragile and you keep asking or demanding consistency from the farmer. And well, that is okay. You can demand quality and consistency, but you also have to take the onus and take the reality check and tell yourself that, hey, we're not going to get consistent waste every time. We have to build a technology. We have to have our own statistics and recipes going into a way that we should also be okay with the variations that are coming in. So I really feel that people do not talk about empathy when it comes to supply chain, but it's one of the most important tools that I have seen, both from the technological standpoint and both from the human behavior standpoint. Because in supply chains, you will often feel that the yarn manufacturer says that, oh, what we do is very critical and you do not understand the specificities. But then you go to garmentier and he would have a same story. because everybody is looking from their watertight compartment. But if you are a company who's talking about material science, you will have to talk about managing new supply chains, building new value chains. And it's probably at this point in time that you have to get into their shoes, understand what's troubling them, and if there is something where you can make yourself anti-fragile, not just robust, like really anti-fragile, so that you can accommodate those things until certain point in time, and then of course have the quality standards and let everybody have learning curve, right? So we really focus on this. We always talk to this about farmers as well, like about this to farmers as well, where we keep saying that okay, it's okay if the first batch is not okay, can you make sure that your second batch is okay? So probably it's not very obvious to farmers as obvious it is to the manufacturing guys. So having that empathy and understanding that these two parties function very differently is what it takes to manage these supply chains together.
Right. Now you're going to all of these, manufacturers who have done things the same way for years, if not decades, right? And you're saying, hey, here is this brand new thing, and it's going to add a lot of value. And what is their first reaction to this? And are they open to things like that, or what is it that you've realized, from iterating that really resonates with these people enough to change what they're doing?
Yeah, well, interestingly, that most of the you probably as an entrepreneur, your first instinct is that if I show them that there is some premium involved in working with these fibers, it would be enough because well, I'm helping you earn more. Well, that is a must, but that's not enough because most of these big manufacturers already have their ball rolling. They do not need you to take care of their basics. They do not need you to even take care of their premiums in certain cases because well, the world was still functioning if you didn't have these fibers. It's just now that the world understand that we need better materials, and probably the first mover disadvantage comes into picture where you need to convince them and have the faith in the vision. So it's the premium part, of course, the economic part is important, but knowing that that alone would not sail through is where the things start, and you start to think about what else can I do to help them be our partners or encourage them be our partners. And then the second layer of difficulty comes into picture, which is if you see a typical manufacturing, it's all about efficiency. They need the machine to operate with efficiency. They need the machines to give out the maximum output it can. And also by nature, if you bring in a different input, that efficiency is not going to be up to mark initially, right? You have been working with cottons for decades, for century probably. So there is certain learning curve and there is certain design of machine which is okay working with that sort of fiber. But if you take in a new fiber, there might be nothing wrong with the fiber. It's just a matter of building that learning curve. So now the question is that how do you manage emotions of the people who are there on the factory floor? Where you can make them feel that oh, it's only because the first three trials are not going to be up to mark, but it is going to help us understand what it takes, and maybe at the fourth or the fifth trial we are going to be okay. So probably these are the two key boxes that I try to take care of, that what can I offer to the top management, to the decision makers beyond premiums or beyond economic benefit, and how can I help their production floor be comfortable in trying that innovation, because they've been trained for efficiency, not for innovation, not for volatility. So it's probably these two things that you have to manage when you work with Indian manufacturers as your value chain.
Hello, everyone. You can get back to your regular programming in less than a minute. An interesting newsletter that I came across is The Gist. The Gist basically curates and explains the most important business and startup news from India in a very fun way. Their articles are very comprehensive. They cover all the important points, but aren't so long that it becomes boring to read. I believe it's a great way for young professionals or students to keep in touch with the ever-evolving and changing landscape of India's business and startup ecosystem. So head over to The Gist, that's gyst.com, and let me know what you think. The link is in the show notes. So at the end of it, do consumers care? Are people willing to even pay a premium for sustainably sourced materials and goods and so on, right? And sometimes I feel this is almost at the risk of adding to the bottom line, right? Whether it's in terms of doing new things on manufacturing, or spending marketing dollars on educating people and so on, right? So do enough consumers care about sustainability?
Yes, enough as it would be in any industry in the beginning. So, right, I wouldn't say that all of them care, but there are enough number of people for you to say that there is a market case. And the number two thing is that there's a very good growth rate in the people who start to believe that from year to year, right? So when you start a company, the truth also is that you're not prepared to supply for millions out there. You are also prepared to supply to niche, and these early adopters are in fact the right people to tell you about how the others are going to react towards it. So having said that, I would say it's the number is big enough for you to start building that company, so that you would be prepared when this number keeps growing. It's not something that is going to be like 0 today and 100 tomorrow. So yes, there are enough number of people who care. And in fact, Gen Z coming to the power, the whole COVID wave, the whole awakening about climate action is only accelerating the increase in the number of people who believe and are okay paying even more for the sustainable fibers. Having said that, onus is also on the technology makers to make sure that it is economical enough. So we also have to spend significant of our time understanding that yes, the product needs to be good when it comes to environment or social responsibility, but it also needs to be high performing when it comes to functionality and pricing. So it's probably a very interesting thing to balance, and that kind of trickles back down to the fact that it's not just a for impact company, it's also a for profit company, right? So it's probably making sure that you also make the technology and the material worth mainstreaming, worth something that millions of people out there will be able to afford, will be able to inculcate in their lives, right? So I do not think there would be anyone who says, hey, I don't want to buy this if this is more sustainable. Yes, there might be some people who would say that I don't want to buy this because it's more expensive. So probably we need to understand that yes, people are up for sustainability. We will also have to understand their needs and kind of match it up. And then there's a third angle, which is you also need to make them realize that it cannot be as cheap as very unsustainable material, because in that case, if they were not paying by dollar, they were paying in trees and clean water and clean air as a currency. So it's also communicating back to them that, hey, if we are not making you pay in terms of clean air, clean currency, biodiversity, you might want to spend $1 extra on it, right? So it's probably walking that balance, understanding them and making them understand the reality of sustainability.
I think there's a growing demographic that stands for values and are voting with their money, and I think that is key. On that note, how has the perception of sustainability evolved, and what will it take for us to make sustainability mainstream?
Well, I think different things will have to come together. So, of course, the consumer perspective, as you said, fashion has become a language. People kind of use their clothing or even articles that they buy, whether it's a carpet or how your home looks, how your house looks like, things like this have started to communicate what they stand for. So these are the subtle languages, right? So if you ask a Gen Z, there are very high chance, even a late millennial, there's a very high chance that they would say that if I stand for sustainability and if I was aware that my t-shirt was made by deforestation or kind of impacting the ocean health or the water quality, I would, if I had a choice, I would rather resort to not buy it. So there's definitely a consumer perspective that's evolving, but there's a lot of work that needs to be done from the industrial perspective, because it's very easy to go ahead and say that, hey, there's a lot of overconsumption out there, but why don't you accept that there is overconsumption because there was a problem of overproduction, so that you can get the right unit economics, and you went on to market that overproduction to lead overconsumption, right? So probably the industry also needs to come and do the reality check that it is not about bringing the cost of per piece down in dollar, and so that selling 10 t-shirts instead of one. So it's also a lot of industrial psychology that needs to be played around with at different levels. It is also something which is consumer driven, because now people question greenwashing. They are coming to the fact where they will question if you use only recycled polyester and say that, hey, it's very sustainable, but they know that it's still plastic. So it's probably moving in tandem. And the third thing that needs to play out is supply chains and innovation. So these innovations are all still teeny tiny. They need to come and understand and have a fact check with, will they be able to scale if the supply chain is a cruel place to be. Probably these are the three things that needs to be in tandem, and that's what it would take to make sustainability a mainstream thing.
Right. And I think we mentioned this earlier, that it's going to be a mix of regulation and innovation, and this is where the government comes in, right? So what do you make of the fact that you will have to work with perhaps different governments at the state and central level to bring some of this innovation to the people?
Yeah, I think for us there are two important interfaces where we have to work with government as and when we grow as a company. The number one is, look, whatever the cotton prices are today, or whatever the polyester prices are today, it really took decades of subsidies, decades of benefits from the government to bring it down to what it is today. You cannot expect an innovation to come to that level of pricing efficiency without the support for that innovation in terms of money, in terms of infrastructure. So there definitely is a need where the government needs to subsidize, needs to support, not only through money but also through I think also through indirect means, so that choosing sustainability becomes an attractive option for the industry. So that's really one arena where government needs to step up. And the other is agriculture waste supply chains. When you look at farmers, they have been used to only selling food and fruits, and that is also a lot disputed in this country lately, that how would they sell their harvested product. And now it comes to a question that how would they sell the waste, right? So then there's a lot of local government support that needs to come into picture, whether it's educating the farmers down there, or whether it is building ways and mechanisms to get and transport those waste into the right industries. So it's probably at both the levels where I see the government will have to play and step up and build channels of support. Well, as I speak, I can also think of a third thing, which has to do more of with manufacturing, right? I think you cannot build a sustainable world by saying that your manufacturing will not be sustainable. Probably it's one of the most crucial part in the equation, that your manufacturing needs to be sustainable. So changing things like the energy we use, or subsidizing the innovation that are more on the green innovation category, could also be a game changer. So probably these are the three arenas where I feel interaction with government would mean a lot to AltMat.
Right. So one of the questions we often ask entrepreneurs on the podcast is, what does it take to operate in the domain that you've chosen, right? So what are some nuances of operating in the sustainability space?
Well, okay. I think the first thing is understanding that things are not going to be from 0 to 100 on day one. So you really need to have an incremental perspective and put in action to make sure that you're going from 0 to 10, 10 to 20, probably as and when you move as a company, and maximizing your energy to see that the speed of growing from 10 to 20 to 30 is as high as it could be. So it's making sure that you're not growing extreme, you're not prioritizing perfection over action, and just doing everything that it takes bit by bit. So yeah, I think sometimes when the people are operating in the sustainability zone, it also creates a lot of climate change anxiety, because you are diverting your work energy, you're directing a lot of what you are to understanding the problem. And it sometimes become very challenging to understand that, oh, this is going really bad, the water here is going to be super bad if we keep doing that, and it feels like a doomsday on some days. But well, you have to understand that it might be as worse as it could be, but you'll have to focus on incremental action. There is no other way of saying that, hey, I want to be an extremist and say that completely turn this off, but rather saying that what are the actions that we can put in each step. So that's number one thing that I feel uh, needs to be brought into place if you're operating into sustainable spaces. In our case, because we also operate into material science space, it is important to understand that as much as it is important to have your technology, your scalability, your infrastructure in place, it is also important to have supply chains in place. So that's another nuance, that technology and infrastructure is only the half work done. The next half, the most important half, come by making sure that your innovations fit as a plug and play solution into the supply chains that exist, and how you can nurture these supply chains for the years to come. So these are the two things which I feel from the sustainable space, and then if you are into material science sustainable space.
Right. So, what do you have coming up at AltMat, Shikha? Any new product lines, expanding to other geographies and so on?
Yes, absolutely. I think a lot of what was happening up till now was more of building the technology, validating that technology, and building the infrastructure that it takes to scale. Now that we have the commercial scale factory in place, it feels like it has the first three steps have been taken care of. So the now next step is also about putting this out on a lot of retail stores, that you go and shop and just find that, oh, this is the same t-shirt that I bought probably last year. It feels the same, but just the materials have been changed, right? So probably that's our number one thing right now. In short term, we are looking to to make our brand anchor partners more stronger, to get into a consortium mode and start rolling out these products and see how the final consumer reacts to. In more longer term, or rather I would say in 3 years pipeline, the key things that we are doing right now is, one, launching more fibers, because we're sure that you cannot take away the luxury of choice in the name of sustainability. So you still have to be sustainable while providing choices to the humans out there. So that's like probably doing more fibers for the flexibility in the supply chain, for the choices when it comes to consumer. The second thing is doing more application, as we were talking in the beginning, that these fibers could be applied to more beautiful things than we have done up till now. It could be a biocomposite, it could be upholstery, it could be the chair, hard composite, it could be a laptop body. So we would be testing number of different applications, and kind of taking these materials as a sustainable ingredient into another application. And third, and the most important thing, is decentralized scale up. So we are going to replicate this production line on different continents, closer to different agriculture hubs or textile hubs, so as to make sure that as and when we scale, we do not fall prey to the vices of global production, but also befriend the benefits of local production, and kind of stand against overproduction. So it's probably a strategy that is more of an ethos to us rather than just material science. So you would see us replicating these production lines on different continents.
Wonderful. So at every leg of the journey, I think the founder has to transform themselves to, drive the next level of growth and so on, right? So what are some high level challenges that you are working on as a founder right now?
Yeah, well, it's absolutely true. I think it takes a very different version of a founder to go from one stage to another. Sometimes you're required to be more open to ideas and more receptive of those different ideas, brainstorm more. But probably at another stage, you're required to say no to most of the ideas that defocus you, and you need to focus on one thing. For us, we have been through these two steps, and now it's all about scale up, right? So it probably would need a lot of collaboration mindset. So what we are looking for is collaborations at different parts in the company, whether it's with the agro companies, whether it is with the manufacturers or the brands, or even sometimes some amazing studios who know how to play with these fibers to make well engineered products out of this. So I think the next thing that we are progressing into requires a very collaborative mindset and figuring out win-win scenarios in different ways of collaborating with different kinds of companies across the globe. I wouldn't say it is a challenge. I would say it is one of the most exciting things we are looking forward to.
Wonderful. So, you were a young person who came back to India to solve this problem here, right? What is your advice to other young people who might be listening to this podcast and they have a problem or they have a challenge that they're passionate about and they want to solve for that? How should they go from, idea to product to company?
Yeah, well, I think the step number one is probably acknowledging and accepting that if you are young, if you are women, if you are brown, all these different cultural dynamics do come with their own pros and cons. And when I say cons, it also come with their own pros, right? So it just helps to accept what is and move on to have a solution mindset. So if you think that you're not being taken seriously because you're young, okay, acknowledge it. Probably do not fight it and question why is it so unfair. Well, it is unfair. I accept it. Nobody said it's going to be fair. But then quickly have your pity party in a short time and move on to a solution mindset. What can I do to make sure that I'm taken seriously? Will it take me being above average technically sound? Will it take me proving through a milestone? So that mindset really helps. You will have your pity parties and it's okay, but it will help to move on as quickly as you can. The second thing that comes into picture is it's about making sure that sometimes it will not be your battle to fight the war, right? So if you're an entrepreneur, you're really out there trying to win a war where you have to go through different battles to win the ultimate thing. Sometimes somebody else's perception is not your battle to fight. So you should rather not defocus and focus on being meritorious, because at the end of the day, all these things that do not matter will settle down, and what will play out is how well you can play your own game. So I think that's the second thing that I would say. Do not let this distract you. And the third thing that I would say is, believe me, if you started when you are older, it will have its own challenges. Maybe you had the luxury of a job that was paying you well, you were at a high position and you were not required to do the mundane tasks. And at that point in time, if you decide to do a startup, it will have its own trouble of managing your own ego, managing your family back out there. And if you start young, there's going to be a different set of problems. So trust me, there's no unfair advantage or disadvantage. At any point in time you start being an entrepreneur, your ecosystem will bring along its own advantage and disadvantage. So it's the best to accept it and make the best of what you have.
Awesome. Well, I hope that serves as a clarion call to all of the young people listening to this podcast to go and start up themselves. Shikha, this has been a fascinating conversation. And before we let you go, I must ask you your recommendations for books or podcasts that you are passionate about.
Oh, yes. So I think from an entrepreneurial standpoint, if you're building a company, if you're truly wanting to build a legacy, do follow this book called Good to Great as a Bible. It really teaches you about the nuances that you need to learn. If you're building a manufacturing startup, if you are building something that requires understanding of supply chain, understanding of what it means to have your technology outdated by a new technology and how do you want to keep up with it, do read out this book called Anti-Fragility. It really helps. And probably if you want to understand empathy and perception, and if by any chance your life has allowed you to understand Mahabharata, also study the book called The Palace of Illusions, because then it allows you to see that, oh, this is the story from Pandava's viewpoint, this is the story from Draupadi's viewpoint, right? So it just gives you a very rich perspective of how situations play out and how you can understand even your enemies. So probably study stories from the point of views of different characters. It could be something else, not necessarily Mahabharata. It could be something that has to do with the way you were brought up or the way your religion is. But do try to figure out at least one story where you can read that story from the perspective of different characters.
Awesome. Awesome. That's a great note to end the podcast on. I said this before. I mean, these are conversations that make me really optimistic for India. We have bright young people like you solving the really hard challenges that the world itself faces, right? So thank you so much for being on the podcast, Shikha, and really look forward to all of the wonderful things that you're going to do going forward.
Thank you so much. The pleasure was mine. And again, congratulations for bringing out this story so well on your podcast.
Thank you. Thank you so much for listening. If you liked this episode, then don't forget to subscribe to us on your favorite platform and share this episode with all of your fellow startup operators. Also, follow the Startup Operator on LinkedIn and Twitter for more updates. Stay safe, take care, and see you soon on a brand new episode of the Startup Operator.